Welcome to the press conference for the reintroduction of the Philippine Human Rights Act by Representative Susan Wild. This press conference is hosted by the Malaya Movement, Kabataan Alliance, and the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines. Next slide, please. My name is Justine Suegay. I'm from Kabataan Alliance and based here in Virginia, and I am your MC for today's press conference. We are very excited for the reintroduction of the PHRA in 2021, and this is the direct result of continued grassroots organizing work happening to gather support for human rights in the Philippines and advocate for the passage of the PHRA. And next slide. And so before we begin, we will go over some Zoom etiquette. If you are press, please add press to your name so you can be identified by the organizers. And to minimize noise, we ask everyone to be muted. And if you have any questions, to please send your questions on the chat directly to the person designated or named questions. This stream is being recorded and streamed live on Facebook. To join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtags #HumanRightsPH or #PassPHRA. Next slide. So to begin, we will have a video message from the Philippine Human Rights Act champion, Representative Susan Wild of Pennsylvania.
Congresswoman Susan Wild, representing Pennsylvania's 7th Congressional District. I'm proud to announce that today I am reintroducing the Philippines Human Rights Act in response to the mass human rights violations perpetuated by the Duterte regime against dissidents, labor organizers, members of the clergy, and others. What this bill says is very simple. U.S. taxpayer funds should not be used to supply weapons to a regime that violently targets its political opponents, including U.S. citizens like Brandon Lee, a human rights activist who was shot by state security forces in 2019 and remains paralyzed from the chest down today as a result of that attack. Brandon deserves to know that his government stands with him, not with his attackers. Tragically, however, so far we have seen 2 administrations, one from each party, demonstrate an unwillingness to challenge the arms sales that the United States provides to the Duterte regime. Meanwhile, the regime has continued its assault against the fundamental rights and dignity of the people of the Philippines, including assassinating 9 human rights defenders on March 7th of this year, a day that activists are referring to as Bloody Sunday. By blocking assistance to Philippine security forces until such time as human rights standards are met, this bill makes a common sense proposition. Standing up for human rights requires more than rhetoric. It requires action. The organizations involved in this fight demonstrate why it is so crucial. They span the spectrum from grassroots human rights organizations to faith groups to labor unions like Communications Workers of America, CWA. As a member of Congress who represents a district with a rich legacy of multi-generational labor organizing, the story of how CWA got involved in this effort is particularly inspiring to me. In 2016, a delegation of striking Verizon workers traveled to the Philippines to see firsthand the devastating conditions of call center workers there. In turn, labor organizers in the Philippines supported their brothers and sisters in the labor movement across the United States. Since then, organized workers in both countries have continued to solidify their bond, even as the Duterte regime has ramped up its attacks on the Philippines labor movement since coming to power. This is about solidarity. It's about standing up for one another and understanding that protecting labor rights and all human rights here at home requires supporting those same rights abroad. To the government of the Philippines, I want to make clear, we respect the sovereignty of your country. This is about our sovereignty. It's about U.S. taxpayers having a say over where our tax dollars go. And for many of us, it is imperative that funding not go to a government that brutally represses those who oppose it. So, as I reintroduce this bill, I look forward to working alongside all the organizations and activists who are championing this cause. I am calling on the administration to engage with us and to live up to its promise of centering U.S. foreign policy around the defense of human rights and dignity. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much to Representative Wild and her staff for that message. So our next speaker is going to be Brenda Roberts. From Communication Workers of America. Brenda Roberts is the Vice President of Communications Workers of America, District 7 in the Mountain West and Chair of CWA's Customer Service Program. In her role, VP Roberts sees how the race to the bottom by multinational call center contractors hurts workers in communities across the globe. In 2019, she led a delegation of CWA members to learn more about the working conditions at outsourcing companies and to build global solidarity between U.S. and Filipino workers. It's Brenda Roberts.
Good afternoon. My name is Brenda Roberts. I am the District 7 Vice President for the Communications Workers of America. CWA is proud to be here today in support of the Philippine Human Rights Act, especially as working people continue to suffer under the brutality of the Duterte administration. I would like to thank Congresswoman Susan Wild for introducing the Philippine Human Rights Act. It could not come soon enough. We have heard stories from our friends and allies in the Philippines about increased persecution, red tagging, and attacks on labor activists and human rights defenders. CWA has worked alongside our brothers and sisters in the Philippines for many years now. When our members were on strike at Verizon in 2016, Filipino workers reached out to help us in our fight because Verizon routed calls from the striking call centers to them. That brave act of solidarity resulted in our members meeting with those call center workers in the Philippines and learning about the terrible conditions that they face and their fight to improve their working conditions. Then in 2019, I had the great opportunity to lead a delegation of CWA call center workers to the Philippines. We met with the leaders from the Unified Employees of Alorica and shared our experiences with each other, finding similarities between the ways the companies exploit the workers in the US and in the Philippines. I was blown away by the courage of these workers who risk being arrested and put in jail, yet they continue to fight for their right to organize and improve their workplace. That is why CWA is committed to work in solidarity with workers in the Philippines and use our voice to speak out against the climate of fear and retaliation and the targeting of workers that is on the rise. Duterte administration's use of anti-terrorism law has not only left a chilling effect on work of labor activists and human rights defenders, but it has also led to the imprisonment and execution of many. CWA mourns these senseless and tragic murders. Zara Olivares was one of the many activists who has been tragically killed. Zara was a friend to CWA, and she provided critical paralegal work to document the situation of Ann Kruger, another Filipino activist and friend to CWA, who hosted CWA members in her home and was arrested in 2019 on false charges and put in prison. In March of this year, we saw the Armed Forces of the Philippines and Philippines National Police carry out a series of joint operations that led to the murder of 9 activists and arrest of 6 others. The victims were members of progressive organizations that advocated around labor, housing, indigenous rights, and environmental protections. 3 weeks after these attacks, we learned of the murder of Danny Miguel. He was the vice chair of the Southern Labor Union and president of Fuji Electric's labor union. He died while wearing a red shirt that said, fight for salary, rights, and jobs. These sorts of devastating losses are far too common. It is clear the attacks on free speech and democracy are on the rise in the Philippines. We cannot stand idly by while Duterte kills labor activists one by one. We must condemn it and do every single thing within our power to stop it. And that starts with legislation like the Philippines Human Rights Act. Workers must be free to exercise their human rights, including the right to form and join unions. All of us, especially those of us in the labor movement, cannot fight for our own dignity and rights here without standing with our brothers and sisters abroad. An injury to one is an injury to all. CWA is committed to battling against the sorts of egregious labor and human rights abuses that are the reality facing the Filipino people under the Duterte regime. And we are proud to be in this fight alongside our friends and allies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Brenda Roberts, for reminding us who this Philippine Human Rights Act is for and who we seek to protect with it. And just a reminder to folks, if you have any questions, to please direct your questions and message the person named questions on the chat. Thank you. And next we have a video message from Neri Colmenares. Representative Neri Colmenares is a human rights lawyer and was the senior deputy minority leader of the 16th Congress during his 3 terms as member of the House of Representatives.
The Filipino people would like to thank Representative Susan Wild for continuing advocacy for the passage of the Philippine Human Rights Act. President Duterte's horrible human rights record is uncontested. He has publicly shown his disdain for human rights and his intolerance of dissent, which led to the killing of thousands of Filipinos and the incarceration of activists, members of the opposition, and even ordinary Filipinos who dared criticize him for his incompetent COVID response or his kowtowing foreign policy to favor China. It has been reported that the United States gave the Philippines $680 million in military aid since 2015. It has also been reported that the U.S. gave the Philippines $30 million last year during the visit of Acting Defense Secretary Christopher Miller in December of 2020. The Filipino people is sure that not a single American taxpayer would want to spend a single American taxpayer's dollar to kill Filipinos and fund a regime who has become a tyrant and a repressive government under President Duterte. No interest is served by funding a regime who will use these funds to prop up President Duterte and may even use this to perpetuate himself in power during the 2022 presidential elections. That is why we ask members of the U.S. Congress and the American people to support the Philippine Human Rights Act. Human rights should be a primary consideration not only in domestic affairs but even in foreign relations. And the passage of the Philippine Human Rights Act will definitely save Filipino lives. We thank all those who support the Philippine Human Rights Act and hope for its swift approval in the U.S. Congress. Maraming salamat po kay Representative Susan Wild and all her colleagues who support such a relevant and timely endeavor as the approval of the Philippine Human Rights Act. Salamat.
Okay, maraming salamat po. Thank you very much to Representative Colmenares for that message. And now our next speaker is from Investigate Philippines and International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, Derek Duncan. Derek Duncan is the Area Executive for East Asia and the Pacific for Global Ministries of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and the United Church of Christ, and is based in Cleveland, Ohio, USA. Derek is a member of the Commission for Investigate Philippines and a founding member of the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines US Network. Derek?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I represent Global Ministries, which is the agency responsible for international partnerships for two denominations, the United Church of Christ in the US and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the US and Canada. Our churches have, for over a century, enjoyed ecumenical friendship with the churches and communities of the Philippines. And today there are many Filipino Americans who belong to our congregations in North America. These close historic relationships inform our commitment to solidarity with the people of the Philippines. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, wrote that the community of faith is like a body in which all parts are responsive to the joys and pains of other members of the body of Christ. We have stood with our sisters and brothers in the Philippines through decades of dictatorship and persecution. Whenever the people have suffered from economic and political exploitation, we have advocated with them in international venues and in the offices of Congress, often in coalition with colleagues in other mainline denominations who speak from their on-the-ground experience with their church partners. In recent years, we've been deeply concerned about President Duterte's rampant human rights abuses against the vulnerable, legal advocates, and rights activists from all sectors, including church leaders. Despite the rhetoric of the Filipino government, red tagging and harassment, illegal detention, and even extrajudicial killings have only increased under Duterte's policies. We especially decry the red tagging and false charges brought against leaders of the United Church of Christ in the Philippines, like Bishop Hamuel Tekis, leader of the Haran Center of the UCCP in Davao City, which has been a sanctuary for Lumad indigenous tribes whose land has been forcefully taken for mining and agribusiness interests, and against UCCP pastor Daniel Belluccio, an ecumenical disaster response coordinator in the Albay province, who was falsely accused and arrested for harboring weapons and explosions. Early on, we joined the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines in order to work in a concerted way to end the violence and impunity wielded by state forces in the Philippines. In recent months, I've been honored to serve as a sub-commissioner in the International Investigate PH process. In our series of reports this year to the public and to the United Nations Human Rights Council, we've undertaken a thorough documentation of human rights abuses through the direct testimony of victims and their advocates. We are pleased and thankful to Representative Wild for her reintroduction of the Philippines Human Rights Act into Congress. We are encouraging advocates in our churches to contact their representatives to urge support for this important legislation. The U.S. is a major funder of the Filipino government and military, and we must use the mechanisms obliged under U.S. law to enforce compliance with international human rights standards and those measured by our own U.S. State Department in its Human Rights Country Report on the Philippines. We will continue to stand in solidarity with our partners in the Philippines. The Philippines Human Rights Act will be a critical pillar in that platform, supporting justice and accountability from the Philippines government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derek, for reminding us about how broad our movement truly is. And next, before we move on to our next speaker, I would like to remind everyone again that if you have any questions, so please direct them to the questions in the chat. Next, we have speaking from the Malaya movement is Yves Nibunko. Yves is part of the National Secretariat of the Malaya Movement, a broad movement of various individuals, organizations, and formations united under the goal of defending, upholding, and asserting human rights, democracy, and sovereignty in the Philippines. Yves?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for all of you who have gathered today. On behalf of the Malaya Movement, our chapters in dozens of cities across the United States, Canada, and Australia, and hundreds of our activists, we thank Representative Susan Wild for her unwavering commitment to the cause of human rights and democracy in the Philippines, not just in words, but also in deed. Our activists have been working tirelessly to raise awareness about the urgency of the human rights situation in the Philippines, organizing a resistance movement across the diaspora, and taking action to support the courageous struggle of Filipinos back home, human rights defenders and activists in the front lines fighting against Duterte's tyranny. This day is for the victims of the Duterte regime's atrocities, the tens of thousands killed in Duterte's drug war, and the hundreds of extrajudicial killings of human rights defenders, farmers, journalists, trade unionists, and activists. We uplift some of their names today. Emmanuel Manny Asuncion, Abner and Edward Esto, Ana Maris Lemita Evangelista, Ariel Evangelista, Melvin Greg Dasigaw, Mark Lee Coros Bascano, Puroy de la Cruz, Randy Pulong de la Cruz, Dandy Miguel, Roy Giganto, Reynaldo Katipunan, Mario Aguirre. This is also for Jesus Alegre, a 75-year-old political prisoner. He died a few days ago on June 13. This is for the more than 700 political prisoners in the Philippines like Amanda Echanis, Reyna May Nasino, and Senator Laila de Lima. The reintroduction of the Philippine Human Rights Act comes a few hours after the International Criminal Court moved to request an authorization to investigate the Duterte regime for crimes against humanities. These are urgent and badly needed concrete actions from the international community. The human rights situation in the Philippines continues to deteriorate every day. The democratic space continues to shrink. We believe that inaction and the lack of decisiveness to pass the Philippine Human Rights Act comes at a very high cost for human rights and democracy. That is why we call on the US government to end the quiet diplomacy now. We need concrete action. We urge our legislators, both in the House and the Senate, to put human rights first, front and center above US geopolitical interests. Simply put, pass the Philippine Human Rights Act now. Our membership is committed to working to pass the PHRA. We are committed to the restoration of human rights, democracy, and sovereignty for the Philippines. And we are confident that with the people power behind us, we shall overcome Duterte's tyranny. Maraming salamat po.
Maraming salamat. Thank you so much, Yves, for reminding us about the urgency of the PHRA. So now we will begin our Q&A. So if you haven't yet, please direct all your questions to the person designated as questions in the chat. How this will go, they will field your questions and they will be answered by a few of our folks from our team. And so please continue sending your questions. Okay, so we have our first question. We have, which members of the US House of Representatives are on board or are co-sponsoring the PHRA bill? How many in total, and who are those that are opposing or not supporting the bill?
Yves, do you want to answer those?
Yeah, I can take a stab. So currently, we have Representative Alan Lowenthal, Representative Jan Schakowsky, Representative Henry Hank Johnson, Representative Bobby Rush, Mark Pocan, Ilhan Omar, Dinah Titus, Earl Blumenauer, Katie Porter, and Grace Meng in the initial list of co-sponsors. We are still, yep.
Here, I'll follow up on this. So for the initial reintroduction, which is happening today, we have 11 co-sponsors. We can get that list to you if you want that specific list. That would be fine. But last year we had 30 co-sponsors for the initial PHRA introduction, and we're expecting more this time around as well. Our main pushback that we've been receiving is from legislators who have a status quo view of U.S. security aid with regards to the Philippines. In their view, this is the status quo view. Increased security aid helps counter the influence of China. And this is one of their top concerns. This view does not match with the reality that Duterte has been consistently developing relationships with China despite the increase in security aid that we have been providing. This clearly goes against the rationale that security aid is stopping development of a relationship with China, and it's in clear contravention of the popular will of the Filipino people, who were very critical of Duterte's pivot towards China. But we can get that list to you, and there's going to be more people joining on in the next few days as this is formally introduced.
Okay, thank you so much, Miles and Yves. Our next question, is there a companion Senate bill in the works?
I'll answer that too. There is a companion Senate bill in the works. We don't have an exact time frame of when it will be introduced, but we have been in talks with multiple senators about introducing a Senate side, and we are reasonably confident that a Senate side is coming this year.
Thank you so much, Miles. All right, so next question. What are the consequences for the Duterte administration if they do not resolve or do not adhere to the Human Rights Act, or at least comply with the international human rights standards? How can this be implemented by the US government?
So there are a bunch of different tools to punish human rights abusers. On the international level, there is the International Criminal Court, and there have been some inroads on that. But that is an international response. Specifically from a US side response, there are also multiple mechanisms that the US has at its disposal, whether it's through the executive branch, through things like the Magnitsky Act, which would be a way for the US government to impose individual sanctions on individual human rights abusers within the Duterte administration. That would be one tool. But the PHRA, the Philippine Human Rights Act, is an action coming from the legislative branch, which is supposed to reflect the will of the American people. And like Susan Wild was saying, we don't want US tax dollars going towards this. Specifically for the PHRA, if this bill is passed and the Duterte administration does not comply with what we are requiring in the legislation, it is an indefinite pause on all US security aid going to the Philippines until specific reporting requirements and demonstrable increases in positive changes in the human rights record in the Philippines can be shown. So long as the Duterte administration would not be able to show that basic human rights requirements are being met, there will be an indefinite pause on US security aid to the Philippines.
Okay, so this one is a brief one. How can we or the people get a copy of this new bill?
We do have a PDF version of the bill, but it doesn't have a bill number yet. So at this current moment, because the bill is going to be introduced later this afternoon, we are currently waiting for the bill to be introduced and put on Congress's website so that it's easily accessible to everyone. And that's the link we'll be sharing. But if you really, really need a copy of the bill now, we can get that to you. Just reach out to me, and I know one of you hit me up about it, but I'll put it in the chat.
All right, thank you, Miles. So next question, can you give an idea of the timeline for the expected passage of the PHRA?
As with everything in the United States Congress, I cannot give any definite dates. But I can say that as compared to last year, we are having much more movement on the PHRA this time around. Again, I cannot give any concrete dates, but we definitely expect the bill to be going through committee and going through the next procedural steps rather quickly as compared to last year. So hopefully we'll be seeing some movement in the next couple of months. But yeah, we are definitely trying to make things move quicker this year, and we're pretty confident about that.
Okay, and in that same breath, what would it take for the PHRA to make it past, this time as compared to last year?
So for the next procedural step, that we need to get more members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee on board. And we have been in talk with a lot of different members, and it seems like we're getting more traction with people this time around than last year. But again, this is an issue of we just need to be talking with our legislators and having them understand how beneficial this bill would be to the citizens of both the United States and the Philippines. But yes, the next procedural step is to move through the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And so we're going to need more support, and we're in talks with other representatives in that committee.
Okay. And if anybody has any more questions? Okay, I think that is our last question. And yes, we will be talking about next steps and calls to action later on. Okay, thank you so much, Miles and Yves, for answering the questions. And to start wrapping up, I wanted to thank all our speakers, press, and community members for being part of this press conference. The situation in the Philippines continues to worsen under President Rodrigo Duterte and in the midst of this pandemic. So we know that to pass the Philippine Human Rights Act, it requires us to continue to build a grassroots movement behind it. So let us continue to engage our legislators and communities on the issues of human rights in the Philippines and gather more support for the PHRA. So we do have a couple calls to action that we will discuss. So again, we aim to grow the movement against the U.S. military aid to the Philippines. So we've seen today that, work together as Filipinos, labor activists, church people, and solidarity activists, we come together and we want to pass the Philippine Human Rights Act. And to do this, we have to grow our movement even more. And to help us do this, have your organization endorse the Philippine Human Rights Act, join the Malaya Movement, ITRIP-US, and Kabataan Alliance, and help lobby your legislator today. And as Representative Susan Wild said, this is about solidarity. Second, please donate to support the campaign for the Philippine Human Rights Act. This campaign is led by grassroots Filipino and community organizations. While U.S. tax dollars go to the killings in the Philippines abroad, lend your support to the movement trying to stop these atrocities. And you can find all this information on how to get involved and donate at the Philippine Human Rights website, humanrightsph.org. Okay, and that's right there on the slide, humanrightsph.org. Again, thank you so much to all the speakers, community members, and press, and have a great day, everyone.